Pride was much bigger than the UFC at the time. We'd go over to Japan and there'd be 80,000 people in the stadium. They would have like a little jiu-jitsu guy versus a 700-pound sumo wrestler. And then you'd have like the Yakuza was involved in some of those fights. Back then they were making a few $1 million. I was doing the conditioning work and guys were winning and we had a lot of success. I think people think that the pros have this amazing training. Honestly, it's not quite like that. If you were to do something that was to cause them to get hurt, you would be fired instantly. The high-level strength athletes, the high-level bodybuilders, they don't tend to live the longest lives.
What are the kind of hidden culprits that can just wreck your HRV?
Mental stress is a much bigger deal than people realize.
Imagine relationships.
I had a fighter who was preparing for a big fight get hit over the head with a chair by his girlfriend like the week of the fight. In the middle of the night when he was sleeping. Bad relationships, divorces. It's massively stressful and you see it when you look at the HRV. People are going to have higher HRV 90+% of the time. There was very few people using it. I was one of the few people in the US using it with athletes.
What's one of the biggest myths that people have around performance that you've seen?
The single most pervasive myth that I've seen across my career is that if you do that for years on end, you're probably going to accelerate aging.
So Joel, thanks so much for coming by today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think, I'm sure everyone watching has heard of heart rate variability, but probably like me, a lot of people may not really understand it. So I'm looking forward to doing a deep dive on that. Before we do though, I'd really like to hear about your story, kind of how you got started. How did you end up where you're at as, one of the leading experts in the world on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting journey. I can try to give you the short version of 20 plus years here. I was really into fitness as a kid growing up, and I was also playing football. And then I've tried to play football at University of Washington, where you were at, obviously.
Yeah.
And
Huskies.
Had to go Huskies, exactly. And just kind of realized I was never going to be a pro football player. And so I resigned after about a year. But I still love the training side of that. And so there was a guy named Bill Gillespie there who was a longtime strength coach. And I had been into the Russian training and all the same stuff he was into. And I just went down there and asked if I could intern with him. And Bill had been a strength coach for a long time. I was just a young kid, but he's like, yeah, come on in. And we would just spend hours talking about training and lifting together and working with the teams. And that was really my first introduction to strength conditioning for athletes. And I absolutely loved it. And so then I followed Bill to the Seahawks for about a year and interned there. And it was a whole different world. And you realize quickly the world of college strength conditioning and professional, right. It's a very different thing. I think people think that the pros have this amazing training. They're all doing the greatest thing ever. And honestly, it's not quite like that. There's anyone who's been in that field will tell you it's a lot of babysitting to some extent. And the pro athletes, if you were to do something that was to cause them to get hurt and lose a game or two, you would be fired instantly. Right. So the risk reward is very different at the professional level than it is in the collegiate level. And then secondly, you're constantly jumping from one team to the next because the coaches are getting fired or going somewhere else. And now you're in a round robin to find a job. And so I decided I didn't really want to go that route of sticking with professional teams or college teams. And I said I wanted to open a gym. So by pure chance, I opened a gym in Kirkland, which is not too far from here in Seattle.
I used to live in Kirkland.
Did you? Yeah. So I opened a gym there in 2003 and it happened to be next to a place called AMC Pancration. And I didn't know at the time, but AMC Pancration was really the best MMA gym in the world. And then a coach there named Matt Hume, who was one of the godfathers of MMA, it was very, very early days. He'd spent a bunch of time training in Japan and working with organizations over there.
I'm guessing is before anybody had really.
Yeah, like so this 2003, right? Yeah. So in the US, this was like the underground days where the fights were barely watched and no one knew who they were. And the UFC was close to going out of business at that point before it got rescued or got bought by the Fertittas and became what it was. So yeah, it was very, very early days. And, I had a football background, strength background, and I had a guy come over named Ivan Salavari. And he was like, hey, can you train me for a fight? K1 fight. And I was like, I don't know what K1 is, but yes, I can, right? I'm not going to turn down business. I just opened the gym.
Right.
And so I used kind of my traditional approach, which is strength conditioning and football. It's like, we're going to do a bunch of assessments and how strong are you and, different conditioning tests. And my first thought was, this guy is pathetically weak. Like he was 185 pounds. Like, I don't think he could do a pull-up, maybe a couple pull-ups, couldn't squat, couldn't bench, like every traditional strength measure, he was extremely weak. And so my football-minded brain was like, oh, just get this guy really, really strong and he's going to crush everybody and I'm going to look like a genius, right? Well, I started doing that for a while and he did get stronger. And then at one point I was like, I need to go see what these guys are actually doing. And so I went over and I started grappling with them. And the first time I grappled with them, I was tremendously stronger than Ivan was. I was benching 400 plus and squatting 500. So in my mind, I'm like, I'm going to manhandle this guy. And it lasted about 10 seconds before I was completely gassed out my back and I had no energy. He was just treating me like I was a toddler. And it was a really big eye-opening moment. And I realized I don't know anything about conditioning. Like I had learned basics of like running gassers and just kind of the traditional football approach. And I realized how little that actually translated to conditioning in a combat sport where they're not taking rests every 10 seconds, right? A football play is a few seconds and you have time in between plays, and in MMA you don't.
Right.
And so I dove headfirst into just really understanding metabolic conditioning because I realized if this guy goes out and gasses out, it's on me because this was my job, was to help make sure it didn't happen. So I really dove into energy systems and just metabolic training and understanding VO2 max and zone 2 cardio and balancing energy systems. And at the same time, kind of to back up a little bit, I was introduced to really their first commercial HRV system, to my knowledge, called the OmegaWave, even prior to that, in like 2000, 2001. And so I'd been using that with all the athletes I had trained. And it gave me a really good inside window into recovery and what HRV was and how they were doing as far as training. And it was experimentation at that point because there was not much out there. There was very few people using it. I was one of the few people in the US using it with athletes.
And how did you get introduced to the Omega?
Yeah, so there's another story. There's a guy named Randy Huntington, who's also from here, actually. He's from Bellingham, I believe.
Okay.
Great guy, track coach. Worked with Mike Powell, broke Carl Lewis's long jump world record.
Wow.
Just a very experienced USA track and field jumps coach for a long time. Very, very knowledgeable coach. And he introduced me to this thing called the OmegaWave, told me to call this company, and they connected me, basically said, here's Randy's use system. I was going to help them expose it or get exposure in the US because they were a bunch of Russians sitting in Eugene, Oregon making tech.
Yeah, we chatted about this before we started recording, that a lot of this comes from old Russian science.
It does.
It's fascinating.
It is. Yeah, I would say if you kind of look it up, the godfather of HRV is called Bayevsky.
What is it?
Bayevsky is his last name. I can't remember his first name.
Yeah.
But if you look at Bayevsky and HRV, you'll find stuff from like the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
And they were really the first ones. I mean, there's research going back before that, but they were the first ones to really make an application out of it. It started in their space program, as we mentioned. It was used on Yuri Gagarin's first trip into space. They could see what was happening.
Right.
And then the OmegaWave was kind of this sprung out of their program over the years.
And this was at the time the state-of-the-art device for measuring HRV, and I assume other aspects.
They had some other they had like this DC potential that was supposed to measure CNS, which is a little, again, it's kind of one of those Russian things. You don't know what the actual research says because you can't read it, but they they claim
there's some of that in the longevity.
Yeah, their claim was it measured CNS potential, however you wanted to find that, and I still don't know exactly what it measured. But I'll tell you,
CNS being central nervous system.
Yeah, and so it would correlate really well with like ground reaction time and explosivity. So it was measuring something. Yeah, exactly what I don't know. But then they also they would look at like metabolic. They try to measure your lactate threshold and anaerobic threshold with with purely electrodes.
Interesting.
So they had a bunch of different stuff it was doing, but its core, it was doing HRV, but it was very research based. Like it would give you every HRV metric. There's lots of different ways to calculate it, and they would give you both frequency and time. They'd give you 12 or 13 different HRV metrics, which was looking like all these different numbers. It was a lot.
We'll get into that. This might be a good time. I want you to finish your story and how you got started, but this might be a good time where, pretend, you don't have to pretend much. Pretend I don't know anything about HRV. Like, how would you even describe that for people who may not have a technical or scientific background? Like, what do we mean when we're talking about HRV?
Yeah, and that's the most important question to start with, because when I first started using it, I didn't know the answer. I still try to figure out the best way to explain it, because people would be like, I'd have to be like, lay down I had a table in my office, lay down on the table. I'd have to connect electrodes to them and explain why I was doing that. And this was not common, right? This was not something you normally did. You went to a gym.
Right.
And so I'd explain that basically the body has these two branches of what we call the autonomic nervous system. And they're like, what's the autonomic nervous system? Like, well, this is the part of your body that maintains your internal homeostasis to the extent that you need to stay alive, right? So I explained, look, we have blood pressure and blood glucose, and you have pH, you have all these things that have to be maintained within certain parameters. Otherwise, your body can't create energy and you die very quickly. The autonomic nervous system's job is to regulate that no matter what you're doing. If you're working out, lifting weights, you're focusing on work, you're sleeping, the autonomic nervous system is constantly playing this game of conductor and making sure all your systems are doing what they need to do. And there's two parts of this system. And so this is where you get into the fight or flight, which most people have heard of, right? That's the sympathetic branch.
Right.
That's like a dial, and that gets turned up when you're doing something that demands more energy. So you're working out, you're concentrating, doing something mentally stressful, you need more energy for that to your brain or to your muscles. The sympathetic system cranks up power and you get more energy and you're able to do these things. And then on the other side, what we call the parasympathetic nervous system, or the parasympathetic branch, is doing basically the opposite. It's storing energy back into glycogen. It's bringing your heart rate and your blood pressure back down. It's the, I wouldn't say the opposing necessarily, but it's having a lot of opposing functions.
Right.
And so as we go through our life, these two systems are constantly working together to keep us alive and help us adapt to stress. There's a long way to discuss it, but people have to have some background. Otherwise, HRV doesn't make much sense.
Sure.
So what we're doing is measuring that parasympathetic branch. We're measuring the resting tone or the resting activity of that rest, digest, recovery system that we can call it, right? It's the sympathetic is fight or flight. The parasympathetic is typically like rest, digest, and recover.
Are these sort of opposite sides of the same coin, or can both branches be turned on at the
Both
same
can be
time?
turned on, and that's
Okay.
something we've learned, I think, more recently. Is,
Okay, interesting.
again, it's more, I mean, more often than not, they aren't, but
Right.
they don't always have just completely opposing movements.
Got it.
It's the body is constantly adjusting based on what it needs. And there can be times where you can have both elevated.
Got it. Okay. So in general, they're going to be opposite each other, but there may be situations where they're not. And HRV is a readout of the parasympathetic.
Exactly.
Okay.
So what we were specifically looking at is like that resting baseline level of parasympathetic function. And traditionally that had been measured in the mornings or in a very standardized context, because if you're moving around, it's just going to show you that that's low because you're moving around, because you got up, your sympathetic system kicks on, dials us up. So usually you measure it at rest. And traditionally for, decades of research, it was mostly in like 5-minute windows or longer periods, but just laying down or seated in a very stable, calm, standardized way, so you could measure your baseline state each morning. And so really what I try to get people to understand is we're measuring how the body is reacting to the world around it. And that means everything that you're doing, how well you're sleeping, how much mental stress you're under, how well you're recovering from your workouts, what your diet's doing to you, just all, it's just a summation of everything, because it's not selective. It's not just responding to one thing, it's responding to
because
everything.
all of those things are going to influence your parasympathetic state.
Both, yeah, exactly. So anything that influences sympathetic is then going to influence the parasympathetic.
Got it.
So a way to think about it would be, if I was to kind of go from resting state, I'm going to have a pretty low sympathetic, so I'm just resting, and then I'm going to go do a workout. Well, my body needs more energy, so of course the sympathetic system is going to turn up, and the harder the workout, the longer the workout, the more it turns up. And then afterwards, that has to turn back down as the parasympathetic turns on. At some point, you would see, again, this elevated baseline of the parasympathetic system and the suppressed sympathetic. And then as you go through the process of recovery and your body returns everything to normal and goes to adaptive responses, it's going to kind of come right back down to where it started. And so you see this curve, right? If you were to see a perfect example, but there's so many other things that go into it.
And so tell me if this is too simplistic. Again, I know there are going to be situations where this doesn't perfectly fit, but in general, does it make sense to almost think of this like a seesaw or teeter-totter, right? Where,
that's,
parasympathetic, sympathetic, if you've got a bunch of stuff that's pushing you into fight or flight, you're going to dial down parasympathetic. We haven't yet said this explicitly, but when that happens, then heart rate variability goes down, right?
Yes.
In fight or flight mode.
Exactly.
Heart rate.
Yeah. So essentially when you're in rest, your parasympathetic is essentially turning on and off, cycling in response, not in response to, but in coordination with your breathing. So as we exhale, we are getting more parasympathetic input towards the heart. When we inhale, that is shutting off.
Which is why breath work is one of the
why exactly. That's the connection to yoga and breathing, Pilates, breath, all that stuff has some real grounded science in the parasympathetic system.
Right.
So when we're normally at rest, it's called sinus arrhythmia. And so as we are exhaling, the parasympathetic system is turning on. When we inhale, it turns off. It's a pulsation in the sinoatrial node. So we look at how strong that pulsation is, and it's tied to barrel reflex, a whole bunch of stuff. But yeah, we're looking at what is that at rest, and that tells us a lot. If that's suppressed, if that's low, it means that our sympathetic system is shifted more towards that direction, right? So we're still kind of going through that process of coming down from a stressor, or we're under something right now acutely that's stressful.
Right.
Our sympathetic system turned on because our body is still in that heightened state. If we see a much higher parasympathetic tone, it says, oh, our body's really shifted heavily towards the other direction, more towards rest and digest and recovery and regeneration, adaptation. It's more anabolic, all that sort of stuff. And then we see, as you kind of come back, you're going to go right back to where you started. But again, it's the summation of all you do. So people have this mistaken idea that, oh, my workout is the only thing that impacts my. It's not. It's one of many variables that your body is constantly responding to.
And HRV sort of integrates all of these as a I'm going to call it a biomarker, and
Yeah,
you tell me as we go if that's
sure. I mean,
wrong, but
yeah, I don't think
as
so.
a
I think it's right.
as a biomarker that reflects your sympathetic parasympathetic
Balance.
state balance.
Yeah, at the time.
And so we haven't said this yet, but when we say HRV, what are we actually measuring?
Yeah, so we're measuring the beat to beat intervals, and then we're measuring the variability between those. And so people might think intuitively that your heart's like a metronome, that it beats very static and very
Right.
metronome-like, but it doesn't,
Right.
because again, our breath isn't static, the parasympathetic function isn't static, it's cyclical. And so you're seeing, if you look at the beat to beat intervals, the more parasympathetic you are, the more variability there is in that heart rhythm. So HRV is measuring the rhythm of the heart and the variability of those beats to beat intervals versus just number of times you beats in a minute, which is just heart rate.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is really interesting because certainly 20 years ago, 10 years ago, I would have thought that it's constant, right? I mean,
You think
obviously
that?
your heart rate goes up and down, but the distance between beats is pretty constant unless your heart rate is changing. But I think what you're
Not.
saying is, yeah, it's all over the place.
Yeah, it's not. So if you were to basically cut the whole thing out, you would just have this internal pacemaker of around 100 beats per minute, and it would be very metronome-like. If you just cut the autonomic nervous system and you just ran, you would just be like 100 beats per minute. Almost everyone would be right around there. But it's that parasympathetic braking effect of the heart rate every time the parasympathetic system
Right.
pulses that slows it down, and then it's speeding back up, and then it's slowing back down, and it's speeding back up. So it's definitely not very regimented or metronome-like, as long as the parasympathetic system is influencing it. When the parasympathetic system goes completely off or as low as it's going to get, then yeah, it becomes much, much more metronome-like. And that's why you have low heart rate variability. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So in a lot of ways, we see this kind of getting to the longevity angle. I think the more I've looked at HRV and studied all this stuff, I think it's a good biomarker, if you want to call it that, gauge of resilience in a lot of ways, which I think is a huge part of aging. We lose resilience as we age. We lose the ability to adapt the world around us. I think that's what aging is in some sense. It's this loss of resilience that causes greater damage, and greater damage causes lots more resilient loss. So
we're getting a little ahead. We'll
yeah,
kind of weave in and out,
we'll go
but
back.
this raises, I think, a really, interesting question to me, which is that I agree with you. Resilience declines with age, and that's almost one of the kinds of definitions you can use. A loss of homeostasis, a loss of resilience is
it's a loss of adaptability to the environment around us, which causes its own damage and everything else that accumulates as a result. So
the question is, and the HRV is a biomarker of that, is that loss of resilience caused by a shift in the parasympathetic sympathetic balance, or is it an effect? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So
it's both.
I don't know if we
I think I think it's both. So in general, people who have greater parasympathetic tone at rest, higher HRV at rest, in general, they're healthier, they're more resilient, partly because in the broad sense, when you are sympathetically dominant, I mean, you've got that sympathetic system cranked up, you're in a more, I guess, pro-inflammatory state for one thing. It binds the macrophages, it causes some cytokines to be released. It's a more stress, it is literally the stress state by definition. When the parasympathetic system on, it's more anti-inflammatory. There's something called a cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway, which is regulated by the vagus nerve, which is the heart of.
Yeah, I want to get into the vagus nerve too.
Yeah, vagus nerve. It's
part of cool biology.
That's really what we're measuring. We're measuring the resting tone of the vagus nerve.
Okay, so since we went there, let's just start with a high-level kind of description of the vagus nerve and how it fits into parasympathetic and sympathetic.
Yeah, so I mean, the vagus nerve is essentially what is the parasympathetic system in a lot of ways. It's what's regulating the release of acetylcholine. It's what's managing all these different organ systems. It's tied into everything. And again, the body has to have this homeostatic balance, and the vagus nerve is what's driving that parasympathetic function. And so a higher parasympathetic function means just greater parasympathetic nerve activity. It means greater reduction of that stress response. It can turn off quicker. It means less inflammatory response when it shouldn't be turned on. It means all those sort of things that translate to better health and longevity in the long run.
And I don't know how much we know about aging of the vagus nerve.
I mean, we know that as you age, your HRV goes down, right? And that's probably related to vagal nerve function. It's related to mitochondrial changes. It's related to, I mean, one of the things I can tell you without question is VO2 max aerobic fitness correlates to HRV better than any other single marker.
Oh, that's interesting.
Now, there's a big genetic component to HRV, just like there is in VO2 max. But if someone says, how do I increase my HRV, that baseline number, without question, you improve your aerobic fitness. It's somehow tied to mitochondrial function. It's tied to centers in the brain that are co-located with different regulation centers of all of this. people with higher VO2 maxes are going to have higher HRV 90+% of the time.
Okay.
That's just the single biggest thing you can look at and predict what someone's HRV is. Well, what's their VO2? What's their aerobic function?
Yeah.
They're going to have higher HRV if those are better.
Interesting. Okay.
It's the biggest driver by far.
So we'll come back to all of this. I want to go back to your story.
Yep.
So let me just kind of summarize where
Sure,
we were at,
sure.
right? So I mean, you were always into fitness. You worked in as college football, pros a little bit, started your own gym,
Yep.
met an MMA fighter,
Yep.
realized that there's more to it than
Much more to
strength
it.
training or
Yep.
football training. When did you start thinking about HRV in that?
Yeah, so I mean, I had been introduced to that, like I said, even before I'd opened my gym.
Uh-huh.
So I started looking at HRV a couple years before that. Used it at the Seahawks, University of Washington, and I started using the fighters. And very quickly, I realized two things. Like, one, the workout, as I mentioned, is not this sole driver of everything that you think it would be. As a coach, you're like, oh, the workout's going to drive everything. And so, for example, I would do like a really hard workout with somebody. Your assumption is the next day they're going to look fatigued or have lack of recovery, and they didn't. Or sometimes you do a very easy workout, and the next day they would look terrible, and it very quickly becomes obvious that the workout's just one input,
Right.
and there's so many other inputs in life. The second thing you realize is how individual we all are, and that there's so many differences to how we respond to stress. And in my view, we are the summation of genetics and our lifestyle environment for our entire lives, and those things can be very different from one person to the next, since you end up with very different responses to the same stimulus. And then the other thing I would say is I realized, this kind of goes back to my resilience model. When I would look at the Seahawks and I would look at how their body would respond to training and games and everything else, and I would look at how the average person responded to these things, it was very obvious why these were pro athletes. They could just recover from stress so much faster. They were so much more resilient to the stress of what they were putting their bodies through.
And do you think that was primarily a genetic thing or a trained
As
thing?
both, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that no doubt they are genetic freaks of nature. I mean, you can just see that when you watch them move and you watch their athleticism, and they are genetic freaks. But of course, they've also been training their entire lives.
Yeah.
And it's turned on their maximum genetic potential because they've utilized it for so long.
Right.
And they could have never trained, they'd still have better genetics, but they clearly, are athletes at that level for a reason. So you would just see, I would take, like, working with Microsoft executives or somebody, a normal everyday person, and you'd be like, this person looks totally different than this person. And you could see why when you look under the hood, which was fascinating.
So what happened next in your journey, right? So
Sure.
you started working with the MMA
Yeah.
fighter.
Yeah.
and
So,
that-
I started working with one to start with. And then, again, Matt Humes, that got it on the MMA gym, he had lots of fighters coming from Japan. He was an extremely well-known MMA coach. And so I did all strength conditioning. He did all skills training. We started working with lots of world champions, traveling over to Japan for a lot of fights, going to UFC every other week practically as the UFC started exploding. And it went from just very underground sport to a mainstream sport in like a 3 to 4 year period.
Yeah.
And so there was a huge demand all of a sudden for knowledge around conditioning fighters. And so at some point, long story short, my mom had a stroke and I was not in the gym as much because I was trying to take care of my mom. And I started writing a book, Ultimate MMA Conditioning, because I went on a forum and there was just so much misinformation about how to train fighters. It was it was just nonsense. It's like what we have now. There's just so much information and so much of it was bad.
Right.
And so I wrote a book called Ultimate MMA Conditioning, and it went out there, and I had no idea if people were going to buy it, and a lot of people bought it.
Yeah.
And I just tried to organize energy system training in a way that had some methodology and some real strategy, and it wasn't just like, go as hard as you can every day. Because that was kind of the message back then, was like high intensity every day. That's what's going to get you in great shape. And like, no, it's not. I could see by looking at data, by looking at people using HRV and looking at all these performance markers, that it wasn't, and it was not that simple. So I would say the biggest thing that I did, and I still do, is I just looked at things from a data-driven standpoint, an experimental standpoint. Like, okay, here's my hypothesis. Like, let's try this for 6 weeks with people. Let's look at the HRV. Let's look at VO2. Let's look at all these different metrics, resting heart rate, and let's see what happens. And then I tried to learn from those cycles.
So were you one of the
over
first
again.
to really connect HRV with recovery as a predictor of kind of, whether you should go hard that day or take a recovery?
I mean, I think I was one of the first people coaching with it. I mean, that was the idea of the Omega Wave, and that's why they developed it. I mean, they developed it for the athletic populations. They were using it in rowing and swim teams and high volume sports, endurance athletes, but they were, like I said, they were primarily going to institutional level programs. They weren't
Right.
aimed at individual coaches because it was $30,000+, and most individual
Right.
coaches weren't going to do that.
Right.
I was able to negotiate with the Russians. Thankfully, they were willing to work with me to get a much better price than that and make payments. But I was definitely one of the first to see the numbers and then try to make better coaching decisions. And I can tell you, when you start looking at the data and coaching from it, you realize how much you're in the dark without any information. You're just guessing. I mean, if you don't have any data points, you're just making educated guesses. It'd be like trying to do a clinical trial without any data. Like, did it do
Right.
better? I don't know. Like, that's kind of what training is in a lot of ways. If you have nothing to look at, you're like, you can tell, like, are you stronger? Yes. Are you better conditioned? I don't know. How's your health doing? I don't know. Right? There's just so much guesswork involved. And so that looking at that data gave me just a different viewpoint, I think, to understand what was happening and how to tune their programming better.
And I'm assuming the athletes you worked with must have noticed that it was working for them, and that led to sort of a cycle where you became more and more and more in demand.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, the biggest thing I would realize too is we'd have fighters come in from Japan, and we'd be there. Back in those days, there was a big organization called Pride. Pride was much bigger than the UFC at the time. It was the best organization in the world. They had the best fighters, and we'd go over to Japan, and there'd be 80,000 people in the stadium, 100,000 people.
Right.
Half of Japan would watch fights on New Year's Eve. Literally, like, the country would all be watching fights. So it's a really, really big sport, and there's a lot of pressure on these guys. Back then, they were making a few $1 million. It was a big deal. So yeah, I mean, again, Matt Hume was doing the skill work, I was doing the condition work, and guys were winning, and we had a lot of success. And so as I wrote that book, that's part of what drove me to start teaching more online and develop my website, launched the first HRV system called Bioforce, and just all grew out of that demand, because there weren't other people doing it at the time.
So that must have been an amazing time, and you've had a chance to work with some, I'm sure, pretty cool athletes. And other people. Is there anyone in particular or a couple of people that you feel that were just, really fun to work with, or any wild stories you want to share?
I mean, Japan in general was a lot of wild stories, because those fighters had a very crazy life over in Japan. And the big name fights, they would have like Hoist Gracie versus Akibono, which is like a little jiu-jitsu guy versus a 700-pound sumo wrestler.
Oh gosh.
And then you'd have like the Yakuza was involved in some of those fights. The Yakuza, so Pride ended up being shutting down because their Yakuza ties. They were tied to the mafia in Japan, and there was a lot of stuff.
So I'm sure you saw some stuff.
There was
probably can't talk about.
Yeah,
don't want to get yourself in trouble.
Exactly. No, but there's just a lot of crazy stuff that happened in those years. But in general, it was just a fun thing to see the sport grow, and to be in the corner of these fighters that were going from, training with you one day to like in front of 100,000 people fighting the next.
Right.
I was very fortunate. Probably one of my favorite guys is Demetrious Johnson, who's also a Seattle local. So Demetrious, I saw him come into the sport as a complete beginner. He was a high school wrestler, and he ended up being the longest running. I believe he still has the title for the most UFC title defenses in history.
Wow.
And so I personally think he's one of the top greatest fighters of all time, without question. He's the most skilled, the best conditioned, fastest, just an incredible athlete. But to watch, it's a very rare thing to watch somebody go from high school wrestler to one of the greatest in the sport of all time, and to see the entire journey. So his amateur fights, I was one of the referees, and as soon as he started fighting, I was working with him, and I was in his corner for almost all of his world title fights. I was in his corner and was a part of the team. So that to me was just an amazing experience, because you rarely get to see somebody come in from the ground level.
Right.
And then literally become one of the best in the world. It'd be like watching Tom Brady play high school football and then become Tom Brady. I was able to see that.
Be his coach.
Yeah, exactly. Be his coach. I mean, I was in his corner for, like I said, for most of his fights. And in Vegas, you had all the party stuff, all the other stuff around it. But he was very, very grounded, and that was why he was so successful. But he was also so consistent, and I think that was a big part of his success. Is how we approached training was so consistent and so dialed in, and that was why he won so many titles, or defended his title so many times. So I would say, as a whole, as my career, that was probably the most fun and such a great experience to see someone go from that earliest genesis to one of the best to ever do it.
Yeah, that's very cool.
And he's local, like I said, he's a local guy.
There's something about Seattle.
Yeah, it must be. Yeah, but honestly, people don't know this, that Seattle is probably up there, I would say, with the world's greatest history of MMA. So there was Randy Couture is from here. He's from Everett. He's a longtime, super well-known fighter. Josh Barnett worked with Matt Hume. Maurice Smith was one of the first kickboxers to win the UFC. Matt Hume, obviously the guy I talked about, is from here. The Northwest really was a breeding ground for MMA. Maybe it's because it's depressing and dark, and people want to sit and fight.
Longevity science.
So yeah,
something about the water.
Something, but yeah, exactly. I would never have guessed that MMA was ever going to be as big a sport as it was when I first
Yeah.
started seeing it, but it was awesome to just be a part of that growth.
That's neat. Okay, so we talked a lot about MMA and athletes. Most of the people watching this are in it for the healthspan Olympiad, right?
Sure.
And so, what would you say differently about the approach to training HRV? For people who are training for longevity or for healthspan.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing I learned over the years is and this is the way I approach training in general, every sport or every demand has a model. And what I mean by that is there are certain physical attributes and mental attributes that are necessary for that athlete to be successful, right? So if we look at a pro football player versus a soccer player, they have very different physical attributes. If we look at a combat athlete versus any one of those, they have very different attributes. There's a model for success, right? And so I always try to figure out what is that model. And so, like, for example, I had an ultimate frisbee team from Seattle come work with me, and they were a very high level ultimate frisbee team. And I have no clue what ultimate frisbee requires,
Right.
right? So the only thing I can do at that point was start doing as many different assessments as possible: speed, strength, change of direction, VO2. And then you try to figure out, what do the successful athletes have that the unsuccessful athletes don't, right? That's kind of a starting point is, okay, here's all these different metrics that define these athletes. Who are the best performers in the game? What is there something that they have physically and or mentally that the other ones don't? So you kind of have to figure out what makes them tick. In other words, what's the model for success? Because that's the only way you can train someone to get better, is to figure out where their gaps are and then improve those areas. If you're improving things that don't matter, then you're just wasting your time. So I say that because I think we have the same thing applies to health and longevity. What is the model of fitness that defines health and longevity? That's the question we have to answer. What is it that people who live a longer time or are healthier, what is it about them that makes them more likely to do those things? And I think it's clear that VO2 max is probably the single biggest piece of that.
At least for longevity.
For longevity. And then obviously you have to have enough strength to move around. And then I think it's this biological resilience concept that I see, that if I look at people that are living long lives, whether their lifestyle is good or not, they still have this high long resilience in terms of, I see their HRV look differently than other people's who don't have that. So I think you have to build high VO2 and aerobic fitness. You have to build enough strength to be able to do what you want to do. You have to have great glucose and metabolic flexibility. You have to have low inflammation. Like, all these things we know are important are the most important for a reason.
I would agree with that. And I think the only other thing that often gets left out, like, those are all biological things that are super important, is the emotional and the mental piece.
Absolutely.
And that ties in, right?
Ties in
that's
to
what's so
HRV.
interesting about HRV and the parasympathetic and sympathetic balance is the emotional and the mental health piece is also going to influence that biomarker.
Yeah, 100%. If you're chronically stressed out, you have poor social support, you're unhappy, you see that. You see lower HRV, you see lower resilience, you see them under more stress, you see them more inflammatory. And I think they all tie together, as you mentioned. And there's also just the inflammatory reflex is there for a reason. If you're chronically inflamed, the HRV is going to be suppressed.
Right.
And that's a response and a cause.
So this suggests HRV is a very useful, powerful biomarker. I guess a question would be, how useful is it by itself or with others? And I think at some point you talked about how HRV can be used. It's at least correlated with mortality, with a variety of health outcomes.
Yep.
I'm pretty sensitive about biological age clocks.
Yeah, I mean,
but I think this question of, like, how predictive is it? And if we compare it to other biomarkers, that either that have been used clinically, blood pressure, cholesterol, whatever, or some of these newer biological age metrics, where does it sort of fall?
I mean, I share your skepticism with the biological age. I think the idea of, like, assigning a biological age to an organ specific thing with, like, what compared to what is the question. And as your test showed, they're all giving you completely different numbers, right?
Part of it's how you measure it. Part of it's, what are we even defining as biological?
Yeah, exactly.
But that doesn't mean they're not useful biomarkers.
Sure.
I guess that's the fundamental
question.
Yeah,
I mean, the question is, does repeated measurement have value if it shows you improvement? Yes or no? If that's the answer is yes, then there's value to it. I would say HRV as a whole is in line with the big ones, which I would say VO2 max and resting heart rate. Those two and HRV, those three of them are a very powerful combination. They're going to give you a really good picture of what someone's overall cardiac fitness is, what their overall stress resilience is. All those things are going to matter as they age. And again, we see across the board, people that have higher HRV, higher VO2 max, and lower resting heart rates, which are all, aerobically driven,
Yeah.
they live longer in general, pretty substantially compared to people that don't.
So let me probe that, because I guess one of the questions in my mind is how much, especially with HRV, is it the absolute number or is it your trajectory over
It's
time?
both. It's both. So, and we see the same thing with HRV with VO2 max. The higher it is, then you preserve it better as you age. And there's also a big genetic component that is tied to that. But it's both. We want it to decline as little as possible as we age,
Sure.
because that makes us keeps us more resilient, I should say. And I would say we also want to look at how much instability there is on a weekly and monthly basis. So if we're seeing, and again, this comes back to resilience concept, I would say the more your heart rate variability is jumping all over the place, making big changes up, big changes down, it's unstable, that's just a marker of more stress on your body, which means you're less resilient in a lot of ways. As someone gets more resilient and develops higher HRV and they're better adapting to stress, you see less dynamic fluctuations because their body is more resistant to those stressors. And if you think about this, fitness, what happens is our body gets more fit. What's really happening is our body becomes more resistant to the stress we impose upon it. So if we lift weights or do metabolic conditioning, our body adapts by making us more resistant to those things. So next time we do them, it has less of an impact.
Right.
So our body is constantly trying to adapt by becoming more resistant to the stressor. That's what our body's trying to do. And we lose that capacity as we age, which means the same stressor has a greater impact and can cause more damage over time. And we have less ability to resist that stress, and we have, the aging process. So I think, again, if we look at how we're reacting to the world around us, reactability, that HRV jumping, you can call it, instability or however you want to define that, that is a sign that your body's just under more stress. And if you do that for years on end,
Sure,
you're probably going to accelerate aging. If you have less of that and you're more stable and your body's reacting well and it's adapting well, you're going to age slower in the long run.
and so would you expect as well that somebody whose HRV is bouncing around over time, that it's going to, the slope of the decline is also going to be fast?
It should be in general, yeah, because they're under more stress, right? They're under more load, and that's generally speaking going to take its toll over time. And again, this is not like a week or a month. This is aging happens over years and decades, right? It's the same thing.
Right.
If my HRV is constantly all over the place, it's just a reflection. To me, it's a reflection of the environment and your body's ability to tolerate that environment in a positive or negative way.
Right.
And if you're constantly bouncing all over the place, you're probably, doing things that are causing it to happen that are destructive. So I'd say it's both a cause and a reflection of what you're doing to yourself.
Okay. And this brings us to, I think, a really important question from a very pragmatic perspective, which is, let's talk about this in two ways. Like, what's the gold standard for how you measure HRV? And then for people who can't use the gold standard, like, what's the best way for the average person to do this? Because, and I say it's really important for a lot of reasons, but one being, you talked about HRV jumping around. Depending on how you measure it, it might look like it's jumping around.
Yeah, it depends on what you're,
So I think that can create anxiety for people, which is then,
Sure.
not a great thing.
Yeah, so that's a really important question. So again, when I first started using HRV, it was an actual EKG leads, right? We're doing a 6-lead EKG, and you were getting really good data because you were getting the full thing. And then as wearables became more common, what happened is all the wearable companies said, well, people might not want to spend a few minutes a day measuring HRV. Let's just put something on their wrist or on their finger, and then let's measure it overnight, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. It's easy, it's convenient. And so they're taking the average overnight. And initially, they were only doing very small measurements, like 2.5 minutes per hour, and just averaging that because the battery back then would have died if you'd done it all the time. Now, they tend to be making a lot more consistent measurements across your night period, and they just kind of give you this average overnight.
And what if you don't wear your watch at night?
Then you're not going to get it, right?
Well, but it gives me a number. I don't wear my watch at night.
Yeah, I don't know where it's getting that from. I mean, it shouldn't. It really shouldn't.
I've wondered if my HRV is low, and actually, in preparing for this episode, then I realized, oh yeah, I don't wear my watch at night.
Yeah, I don't know what, I mean, that's where most of the wearables are getting them, is just overnight, because you're in a stable-ish state. It's trying to measure you every night, and then it's taking the average across whatever your sleeping period was.
Okay.
There's a lot of problems with that in my mind. Number one is it's so influenced by what you did in a few hours leading up to your sleep. So if you worked out at night, you had a glass of wine, the first few hours of your sleep are just reacting to that.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean at the end of the night that it's where you're going to be is not influenced by that versus everything else.
Right.
The second thing is sleep quality is probably over reflected in your HRV compared to what your body actually ended up at. So the way I look at it, the easiest way I tell people is, if I was going to lose weight, would I want to measure myself first thing in the morning in the same state, or do I want to measure like an average of my weight across the previous day? Like, that's going to have a lot of noise in the system. I would rather say, okay, I'm going to wake up, I'm going to measure myself first thing,
Do a really good
do a
measurement,
really good
same time
measurement,
every
and same
day.
time every day, and standardize it.
Okay, that makes
And
sense.
that's what I want to use as my metric. If we're looking at overnight HRV, and so I have a Garmin watch I use. I also have 8 Sleep I use, and of course I use Morpheus every morning. Correlation's not particularly great, to be honest with you. The trends line up, like the overall average is changing, that will line up, but the daily variation can be completely different from one system to the next. And so I think that if someone is going to use an overnight derived HRV, it's convenient without question, but I would be much less likely to pay as much attention to those variations and make decisions on a daily basis from that.
Got it.
I would be more inclined to say, okay, my HRV is trending up, that's probably a good thing, or my HRV is trending down, that's probably not such a good thing. That, I think, lines up with overnight HRV measurements. But really, the gold standard, the way that HRV has been measured for a long, long time prior to these wearables coming out, and the wearables took a whole new approach. Like, there was not research really of overnight HRV. Like, that just wasn't how it was done. The gold standard is what Morpheus does, my app, where we measure 2.5 minutes first thing in the morning, and we get that standardized context.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Can you take us through what Morpheus is and how it works?
Sure. So biggest thing with Morpheus is I wanted to say, how do we help people connect the dots between their HRV, the recovery, and then what to do from a training perspective. So what Morpheus does is we measure your HRV in the morning. We use a chest strap because it's the most accurate way to measure HRV. A finger sensor is not that it's inaccurate, but it's more prone to motion artifacts. It's more prone to errors. It's not as accurate as a chest strap.
Got it.
So, and it's much less accurate when you're working out. Unfortunately, there's no way a gold standard, the chest strap's going to be beaten for workout accuracy with anything on your arm or your wrist or finger or whatever.
Right.
So you wake up, we do a 2.5 minute measurement. We look at your HRV. We'll give you a recovery test. And then what we do is each week, this is where the dots get connected. We give you a number of minutes to hit for or to shoot for in high intensity, what I call moderate intensity, and then low intensity. So
that's all based just on that couple of minutes of HRV.
It's based on your fitness level, your goal, and the direction your numbers are going and how much training you're doing. So kind of going back to what we talked about, the way we developed this is I said, okay, we have thousands of users. And with this, 2 years ago, we weren't giving recommendations. We were just giving HRV and recovery, and then letting people train in different heart rate zones and giving some methods. But I said, can we figure out volumes and intensities that we see people improve their HRV and their resting heart rate the most in, given their starting point of average heart rate and HRV. So we said, okay, for someone who's low fitness, moderate fitness, or high fitness, but it's categories, how much volume intensity do they do to see improvement versus people that don't see improvement versus people that go the wrong direction and get worse. And so we just used machine learning and found out basically how many minutes roughly these different people needed to get better. And so that's where Morpheus starts. It says, oh, somebody who has your resting heart rate and your HRV on average over 12-week periods did, let's say, 15 minutes a week high intensity, 25 minutes of moderate intensity, and 100 to 150 minutes in low intensity. And so we just give you ranges to shoot for each week. And then we adjust based on whether or not you hit those markers, whether or not your numbers change, what your recovery was, all that sort of stuff. So we're just giving you a guiding point, a place to say, if I hit, 100, let's say I hit 2 to 3 hours a week of low intensity, I hit 10 to 15 minutes of this moderate, and we hit like 5 minutes of a high intensity, chances are you're going to improve, at least based on what we saw in other people.
Sure.
There's no guarantees because everyone's different, but that's the starting point.
And it's affected by other stuff.
That's affected by other stuff, exactly. Yeah. And so we try to adjust, again, weekly based on what we see. So it's, again, trying to take this data of what's your average HRV, what's your resting heart rate, what's your recovery look like, how much you training, and giving people a roadmap to get in their cardiovascular fitness. The goal is to build cardiovascular fitness, to build VO2. That's what we want to help people do.
Right.
Because that, I think if you want one single thing, it's aerobic fitness, VO2 at resting heart rate, all those things.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and you're the expert, so I'm not gonna question your opinion on that. But I mean, it is interesting to think about what is the relative influence of cardiorespiratory fitness and diet and sleep quality.
Sure, they're all
and
huge.
Stress and alcohol and drug use. Like
Yep.
they're all gonna integrate into
Absolutely.
this one biomarker.
They are, and they'll all be reflected in that, right?
Yeah.
So if we give you these targets and then we see in the effort of trying to hit those targets, your recovery is too low.
Right.
It could be because you didn't get sleep. It could be because
Right.
you drank too much. It could be a lot of things.
Right.
But what Morpheus would do the following week is dial those numbers back. So we're constantly trying to adjust those targets each week based on what we see you actually doing.
Got
So that's where the personalization comes in. And to your point, I think people vastly underestimate, in my experience, the impact of their life on their fitness. They really do. They just don't
Yes.
realize how much a poor night of sleep or 2 nights of poor sleep
Right.
or too much to drink one night or just a poor diet, or they really underestimate mental stress. Mental stress
Right.
is a much bigger deal, I would say, than people realize. And we saw this pretty early on. We started, so I could see it just intuitively when you'd ask people, but we started using a team system of Bioforce. We looked at a lot of teams. One of the things we saw that was super fascinating is Gonzaga University women's soccer team, who's in Washington State. We were looking at their women over a course of a season, and you see these periods of just massive stress, and you would think like, oh, this is like playoffs, or like this is some huge thing. It was finals week. You would just
Right.
see in college
Oh,
students
that's
like
interesting.
finals week, or like Microsoft executives, like you would see when they were in product launch mode, like it just trashes them. And it makes sense because the workout is, an hour, maybe 2 hours.
Yeah.
If you're under mental stress for 8, 10 hours a day, it's a big, big load on the body. It's a huge thing to have the body shifted in that that sympathetic fight or
Right.
flight state for
Right.
hours and hours on end.
And I wonder sometimes, there's this genetic component, right? Of course, we recognize that, but how much of that is intrinsic? You're just born with a low or a high HRV compared to the average, and how much of it is the genetic component that influences the way you respond to stress?
I think it's
Because-
both, right?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, what's the relative importance? Because
Yeah.
we all know people who do not manage stress well, right? And then we all know people who manage stress really well, and that's going to have an impact here.
Yeah,
as
and
well,
that's
right?
genetic and it's environmental
Sure.
and it's all of it. So, I mean,
Epigenetic and yeah.
yeah, I mean, it comes down to like even prenatal stress. I think that's super fascinating. Like I read, I don't know how many your listeners follow Robert Sapolsky, but I think Sapolsky is brilliant to listen to, and he was talking about the Dutch famine, Dutch
Right.
hunger strike,
The
right? And
epigenetic
the
effects
epigenetics
that-
effects of all the babies, depending on the
transgeneration.
cortisol they're exposed to in the
Yeah.
womb, like that shows you the importance of stress. Though, is they become hypersensitized to stress. They had more cardiovascular disease, more diabetes, more all kinds of things based on how they responded to stress, which is pre-programmed prenatally. So
or
yeah.
at least influence.
the influence, sure, influence. Yeah. I mean, I think all those things are hugely important. And there's definitely a genetic component
Yeah.
to, I mean, depending on what you read, it's like 40 to 60%, which is kind of the same as VO2.
For HRV. Huh?
Yeah, it's
Interesting.
depending on what you read, like it's kind of all over the place, but
And that's the absolute number we're
yeah, it's the baseline, your baseline resting number. You can influence it,
Right.
but again, there's definitely a genetic component there. I would say is how easily it's influenceable for you is also genetic.
Sure.
And again, I would say in my experience, it is tied to how easily you develop aerobic fitness. You see kind of the same parallels there. And why
sense.
exactly it's driven? It's mitochondrial function. It's all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
But we seem to see people that are very hard to improve their aerobic fitness. They tend to have lower HRV. I put myself in that bucket, unfortunately. And people that tend to be more endurance based, they have easier time building aerobic fitness. They tend to have higher HRV. They tend to be easier to develop in that sense. But it just comes back to that equation.
So it's interesting. You said you put yourself in that bucket then.
Mhm.
So what have you found works well for you to move your HRV?
I mean, so for me, I spent years doing strength. Like I was a
Right.
strength athlete. I loved
Right.
I lifted weights. For me, and I think there's genetic reasons and there's physiological reasons. Just I have to do a lot of lower intensity cardio, and I have to cut my weightlifting.
So you mean like
back.
zone 2? Is that?
Yeah, zone 2,
Yeah.
sure. I have to do a lot more volume of that, and I can't do that much strength work if I really want to develop it. Part of that is a whole other conversation, but when you do low intensity zone 2 type work, you're causing what we call an eccentric hypertrophy of the left ventricle, meaning that the left ventricle dilates, right? It gets bigger, and that's capable of greater blood flow. You have a low resting heart rate. All those sorts of things happen. Your heart is capable of more things from a blood flow stroke volume standpoint.
Yeah.
When you lift heavy weights and you drive high blood pressures, the walls, rather than expanding outward, they become thicker. It's called concentric cardiac hypertrophy, right? It just means they're resisting high blood pressures, and they do that resisting high blood pressures by getting thicker. The left ventricle walls just become less compliant and thicker because that's a better, more adaptive way to resist high blood pressures of heavy lifting.
Right.
The problem is if your goal is to stretch that system, stretch that left ventricle to produce more stroke volume, a thicker wall makes it more difficult because it's less compliant, it's less resistant.
This is a structural
Because of
feature
structural
part.
features, yeah. And so I did a stress echo last year as part of my my own heart journey, and I was about 1.5 standard deviations above the norm for the thickness of the left ventricle. And that's just years. It's not like pathologic like you
Right.
get with, you know,
You've trained your heart to.
yeah, I've trained my heart to do that. So it's not pathological in the sense that we see with massive cardiac hypertrophy from just overweight and all the problems with high blood pressure, very high blood pressure for years. But I cannot get my left ventricle to stretch and have the same stroke volume as somebody who does not have that thickened
Right.
wall. And so I probably have lots of adaptations that cause me to be more resistant to building aerobic fitness. So even though now I've been able to get my resting heart rate down to like low 50s, 51, 52, which is a good number.
Yeah.
My HRV, at least in Morpheus or systems, is a solid like 10 points lower than what it should be, what I would see other people with similar resting heart rates in VO2. So my VO2 is like low 50s, like I said, resting heart rate's low 50s, which for good numbers for I'm 46. But my HRV is lower than it would be, than most other people would be with similar numbers. And
Interesting.
it's always been lower. My HRV's always been lower. So there's definitely a genetic component there.
So let me ask you a question then. I mean, this is, and obviously it's going to be speculative, but you know, we've talked about HRV as a biomarker. It's reflecting the real biology that's driving the diseases. It's not necessarily that HRV is causing disease
to reflect
or
it,
health,
to
right?
reflect them.
So in a situation like yours, do you interpret your lower HRV as putting you at higher, suggesting that you are at higher risk for all of the things that low HRV
I would
is a risk
so
factor for?
I would,
Or
yeah.
do you think it's that the biomarker in your case isn't accurately reflecting the underlying physiological state? I know it's speculative.
Yeah, it's speculative. I would say it's reflecting my increased risk. And I can say that because we can get this now or later if you want. But last year I just figured out or discovered I have an 1800 calcium score and a 50% blockage in my LAD.
Okay.
Now, again, this goes back to genetics. My dad had a heart attack in his late 50s, had a double bypass in the 60s and died at 64. Grandpas on both sides had either heart attacks or died in early 60s. Mom had a stroke in 60s. So I've got about as bad a family history as you could possibly have. And despite a lifelong, effort to be fit and healthy and eat well, I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't do all those things.
Yeah.
I still have pretty bad cardiovascular disease. So this is just N equals 1, but lower HRV probably was reflective of something going on in the hood.
Yeah.
That was
So that's
accelerated.
You have a case example you can point to in your case.
Yeah, my own case.
In fact, you're going to get another CT exam today. So we'll have you back on to talk about that because we've talked about, CCTA with Clearly and putting the AI piece on top of it. And obviously, heart disease is the major killer.
It's exactly. And so, I mean, I would say just anecdotally, again, this is all just me coaching and talking to people. When I see somebody who has a very high HRV, despite not looking like they have very good fitness or health, I'll say, what's your family history? Majority of the time, it's not cardiovascular disease. It might be cancer, it might be something else. But majority of the time, even people who I'll see that look unfit or unhealthy and maybe they don't have the best lifestyle, if they have a really high HRV, they tend more often than not to have a pretty clear family history, particularly in the cardiovascular side of things, at least. My grandma, I measured her. So my grandma, unfortunately, I did not get her genetics. She smoked for 70 years, 2 packs a day, 3 packs a day. She drank.
This is the Jean Calment
she
story.
drank every single night. She lived to be 86. She did get lung cancer at 82, and they were like, "If you should stop smoking now, you might have 6 months to a year." She made it 4 more years after she quit smoking. So she lived a very, very long time, despite doing everything wrong. And when I measured her, she had very high HRV, and I just clearly did not get that.
Right.
So there's definitely, you get that genetic lottery or you don't. And unfortunately, I didn't. The good thing is, I don't know if you saw, there was a study where they looked at VO2 max and survival across different CAC ranges.
Yeah.
Higher VO2 is protective against every single level of calcium. So
right.
it makes a huge difference. And then, what I've seen, it's like 50%. Like it's a big reduction to be very fit.
Right.
And I think part of that is it does build HRV and VO2 relative to what it would be if I didn't do any of those things. So my brother had 3 stents put in at my age, and I don't need stents, and I maxed out the Bruce protocol test, and everything looked great. So I'm obviously doing everything I can to facilitate that regression as much as I can and keep things going the right direction. But I'm still in a spot where I probably wouldn't be if my genetics were different.
Right. And is it your impression that HRV is I mean, obviously it makes sense that it's going to be informative about cardiac function because that's essentially what we're measuring.
Exactly.
Or some aspect of cardiac function, but it's correlated with dementia, diabetes. I mean, I guess a question is that all, do you think, related to impaired cardiac function, or is it that HRV is reporting on these other disease processes
I
and
think
mechanisms.
I think it's the underlying causative function of our causative acceleration or deceleration of aging, of stress and the stress response and the resilience. It's
and chronic inflammation.
chronic
and all this
inflammation. I think
has
chronic
been-
inflammation and
Yeah.
lack of glucose, a lack of metabolic flexibility, I guess I should say. All that is driven by the same processes, and they're all crossing into these different areas for a reason. It's low aerobic fitness, low resilience. I just think the less resilient you are, the more likely you are for the environment to push down on you and cause damage, and that damage accumulates.
Right. So we've talked about some of this, but I mean, you've looked at, I don't know, millions of HRV data points,
Lots,
I'm guessing,
lots.
across, elite populations, average populations, sick populations. Are there any general patterns that jump out that we haven't touched on?
Not that I can think of in particular, but what I'll say is HRV tends to be cyclical, even when you wouldn't guess it to be. So you would think that it's always going to kind of have this same responsiveness to different things, but it's very cyclical. Like there'll be periods where HRV goes up, and maybe you're not doing anything super different, and then it kind of comes back down. There's a cyclical pattern to it. Maybe it's just,
And when you say cyclic, are we talking over weeks?
yeah, over
months?
weeks. Yeah,
Okay.
you just tend to see some like natural rhythmical cycles of HRV
Huh.
over time in people. There's some sort of circadian something going on there.
So
What exactly is, I don't know.
is the take home there not to be concerned about it?
Yeah,
It's
I would think,
normal.
don't
Don't obsess.
yeah, don't obsess. I think in general, people will want to make too much out of one number. It's
Uh-huh.
one number on one day.
Uh-huh.
And I kind of go back to this same thing with like the scale weight thing, because it's people get that. If you stepped in the scale one day and let's say you were 2 pounds heavier than yesterday, you probably didn't gain 2 pounds of fat in
Right.
one day,
Right.
right? You're just reflecting water retention and other things. It's the same thing with HRV. Like if HRV does something you don't expect it to, it's not the end of the world. And I would also say HRV is not, when we talk about recovery is a very vague metric in general. When we say recovery, we're not talking about what your body can do, what it's capable of, which I think is a big mistake people make. They see low recovery. Oh, I can't go hard, or I'm going to get injured. Or more often than not, they'll say like, oh, this app, Morpheus, whatever, said my recovery is low, but then I went out and set a PR. It must have been wrong.
Right.
Recovery is not telling your body what you can do at that point in time. It's not predictive of what your body can do. It's telling you more about what the impact of that will likely be. So in other words, if my recovery is already low and I impose a big stress on myself, I'm just going to push myself further down that hole. It's going to take me longer to get back to that normal
Right.
baseline
And you
state.
might be at a little higher risk of injury.
You might be, yeah.
But
Well,
it doesn't mean you're going to go out and get injured.
no, exactly. Yeah, there's a good story. So Dave Tenney here, he was a sounder strength coach for a long time, or performance coach, I call him. He was one of the first to come into my gym, said, hey, I want to see what HRV does. And so he brought a bunch of the Seattle Sounders, measured HRV, looked at all their numbers, and said, this is valuable. I'm going to start using this. So being close to Microsoft, he partnered with a Microsoft software engineer and really good data-driven guy. And he built a whole model out, not just HRV, but HRV and GPS and subjective markers and just like a whole range of variables. And then what they did was try to model game load and then measure that against practice load, so they could go back to coach using all this data and say, hey, this practice was about 80% of game load. And so the coach had a very intuitive way of understanding like how hard a practice was relative to a game, which was unique and a good way to do it. At the same time, they would model injury risk. And so they'd give the coach a number. Hey, this athlete is at like a 4% injury risk, or like a 3% or 1%, right? And it's normally gonna be pretty low. You're not gonna go out and, so he told me a story one time. He's like, hey, this person and this athlete, they're really pretty burned out. Like their injury risk is like 12%, something like that, like a way high number than it should be.
Yeah.
But it still means there's like an 88% chance they're not, right? So the athlete goes out and scores like 3 goals and has a great game. The coach is like, your data means nothing, like just like
this doesn't understand
does-
probability.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the thing. Like people will look at HRV and be like, oh, my HRV said I was low recovery, but I went out and had a great workout. It must be wrong. Like, no, it's not wrong. It's just, it's not telling you what you're capable of. It's not that, if it was that accurate, I would sit there and bet on sports and look at people's HRV, and it just doesn't work that way.
So I want to tie this back to kind of how we started this section around, some of the ways we can measure HRV, talking about recovery. We won't name names, but most of the devices now will give you a recovery score, right? How much faith do you think people should put in that? How much should they be guided by that in terms of like how hard they're going to go on their workout?
Sure. I think for most devices, particularly if you're measuring HRV overnight, I think less But I think it should just be one data point among many. How do you feel? What do
Right.
you have planned for a workout? What are you doing tomorrow? What's your schedule? All those things go into that decision. And I mean, if I have a number on Friday, I'm taking the weekend off. That's looking different than if I'm on a Monday and I don't want to put. What I would say is most people should look at the weekly schedule as every week I'm going to allow myself to be put under a stressful load from a fitness standpoint. And then by the end of the week, and I start next week, I should be recovered and back to where I'm kind of where I started. Like I should
Okay.
be at a baseline state, because the way that you overtrain, the way that you injure yourself is becoming chronically under recovered from week to week to week, and it accumulates and you go downhill, and then you get an injury. You cross a threshold and boom, you pull a hamstring or
Right.
whatever. So it's this weekly cycle we go through. It should be stress and recovery from week to week to week. And I think if you look at that standpoint of I want to wake up each Monday morning feeling refreshed and ready to train for the week, I'm probably going to be in a good spot. If I allow that stress to accumulate throughout the week, whereas my days off don't allow me to get that recovery back, and I'm starting in a deficit on Monday, if you keep doing that, you're going to pay the price eventually. And so I look at what days of the week am I on? What's my workout plan for tomorrow? How do I feel right now? All those things go into that decision, not just one
any
single number. No,
Yeah.
it's an informative number, but it's not the single decision maker for you. It shouldn't be, at least.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So again, we've talked about some of these things, but what are the kind of hidden culprits that can just wreck your HRV that people may not be thinking of?
I mean, sleep is honestly the biggest by far. Sleep has a huge impact, but I will say there's definitely more individualization to sleep than I think we have been told. Some people actually do fine, honestly, in 6 or 7, 6, very, not a huge number of people, but some people need 7.5, some people need 8. You see different numbers of amount of sleep that people are successful on. Alcohol,
which can affect sleep.
Which can affect sleep, is a really, really big one. I think most people, again, aren't aware of how much that couple glasses of wine they have at dinner can impact them. It's a real thing. It really does impact them. And I think, fortunately, I think we've kind of swung back to the like, hey, less alcohol is definitely better. There's not really like a 2 or 3 glasses a night's not good. Like it just has an impact.
Yeah.
And then again, I think mental stress is the other one that people vastly underestimate.
Right.
Just being stressed out at work, living on social media, dealing with just a job you hate, like all of those things add up.
Fortunately, I don't have that problem.
Yeah, unfortunately, like, those things have a really, really big impact on people's health. And and I would say too, they're all related in the sense that being stressed out makes you eat more. Being stressed out makes you crave the wrong foods. I mean, these are all tied together. Poor sleep can make you crave the wrong foods. Like we can't think of ourselves as these siloed aspects of our lifestyle. They're not. Poor sleep, overtraining, it causes us to crave bad foods. We crave bad foods. We want more alcohol. We get more sleep. It's this cycle.
And I would imagine relationships play an important.
Oh yeah.
Is there data on that?
Yeah. I mean, so you want stories? I mean, I had a fighter who was preparing for a big fight get hit over the head with a chair by his girlfriend like the week of the fight in the middle of the night when he was sleeping.
Oh God.
I'm like, what did he do to you that you hit him with a chair over the head when he was asleep? Something really bad must have happened.
He snored.
Yeah, something. I don't know. I didn't go that many questions deep. But yeah, you see, bad relationships, divorces. I mean, just all that stuff.
Sure.
It's massively stressful, and you see it when you look at the HRV. It just becomes a downward spiral. You see a lot of variability in the variability. You see a downward spiral in general. Like you just see that lack of resilience.
Yeah, and I would imagine that goes the other direction, where if you have high quality relationships, good social structure,
yeah, absolutely,
you're probably maybe protected against some of these other insults that could influence.
I will say the biggest thing I saw is I lived in Hawaii off and on for the winters, and Hawaii, despite not having the healthiest meals you would think, and they don't in a lot of cases, they live longer than any state in the country, which is not necessarily native populations. They've got their own obesity problems.
Right.
But I just think there's a richness in social relationships and friendships and community and all those things you see in Hawaii and you see in Japan, like you see these places.
Right. I think Okinawa is another sort of classic example of extreme longevity. There's some diet there as well, but the social structure.
Yeah, the social structure is really important.
Right.
I think, and again, that's HRV does kind of reflect in a broad sense your well-being.
Right.
And that's obviously tied to the social connection, which is, a big part of that.
Right. So I've heard, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that in women, HRV can be influenced by the menstrual cycle. And first of all, is that true? And if so, how should women think about that as they're monitoring their HRV?
Yeah, it does. The interesting thing again to me is how individualized this is. Some women are going to see a big pattern, and some women are going to see nothing. Now, it could be what birth control pill they're on. It could be their genetics. It's different for every woman. And I don't want to go all the way down this topic, but I would say we've tended to focus on women's health, which is really important. But I think we've almost tended to lump every woman into one category and assume that every woman has the same outcomes based on inputs. It's just not how it works. Sure. Some women are very responsive to it. Some women aren't. During pregnancy, it's generally going to decline because your sympathetic system's producing more energy for your baby. But even then, you know, if a woman goes from not working out and maybe being somewhat unfit or unhealthy and they start really training during pregnancy, they can see it go up. So I would just say HRV is a really good tool for women or anyone else to learn how their biology works.
So the first one is kind of know what your
normal is.
Yeah.
And if you see really big variations in your HRV, you're very responsive to it. Maybe there's ways you can offset that, or maybe there's things you can do to reduce that a bit. Maybe it is. I have seen women switch birth controls and have a completely different HRV response.
So there's a hormonal.
There's absolutely hormonal response, big hormonal component to it. So it's such an individualized thing. I hate to just say every woman's going to see this because they're not. It's a different thing for each person.
Got it. But I would imagine even there that the trends, you know, let's say there's a menstrual cycle to HRV.
Yep.
The trends over months are going to be informative, and the menstrual cycle part,
absolutely,
is you
do exactly. I mean, just keep a record. You should keep track of these things and see how your body responds to them. And then again, it's the same thing as anyone else. If you're going the wrong direction, you know, figure out why.
Yeah. And again, I'm going to ask you to speculate, but I'm just interested to know the way you think about these things. Let's say you're a woman who does have a pretty pronounced HRV shift during the menstrual cycle. Do you think that HRV shift is really reflecting a change in mortality risk or disease risk over that time period, or it's something, it's another potential place where the biomarker might not line up with the physiology?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think we know that women are protected from cardiovascular disease more than men until they hit menopause, and then it seems to line up. So there's something with the hormonal connection, obviously being related to longevity in some sense.
Yeah.
It probably does reflect that you're more.
Then again, don't want people to worry about it.
Yeah. I mean,
because women who are still cycling are young enough that the risks for these age-related diseases are all low. But just from a sort of trying to think about how the bio.
Yeah, I mean, I think it always reflects something. The question is how much does it reflect that? I would say again, it's probably just one data point. If you're hyper responsive and your HRV is all over the place during the cycle, it means probably something different.
Changes of parasympathetic, sympathetic tone.
Yeah. I mean, I would be aware of it, but if everything else lines up, I wouldn't, freak out about it. And it might change as you age too. That's the other thing I'll say.
Yeah.
That's probably the other thing I should say about
everything does.
Yeah. I mean, that's the biggest thing I'll say is HRV really does show you the aging process. And I can just tell you anecdotally, as I hit my early 40s, my ability to train went down a fair amount. Like my ability, I could do 6, 7, 8 workouts a week prior to that.
Just from a recovery
standpoint.
Yeah.
Again, even though my HRV statistically was lower than it probably should have been, I just built up work capacity. I've trained my whole life. When I started hitting early 40s, I would see a much more pronounced effect in the same workout. And I started having to dial it back noticeably. So I would say I'm probably training 70% of what I was when I was in my 30s.
Just volume.
Just overall train volume. I just can't recover from the same. And I've also seen the sleep quality is not what it used to be. I have a harder time staying asleep than I used to.
Yeah, that's difficult.
Like all of those things add up. Like I'm seeing it firsthand now. Like probably that sleep impact is. I mean, it's all tied together. But HRV has really shown me a clear N of 1 of my whole life has been tracked for the last 20 years. To see the changes happening as I've aged has been really depressing, but also fascinating. Right?
I mean, it's interesting because we touched on hormones just a second ago. And so I can't help but wonder how much of that is tied into hormonal homeostasis.
I'm sure it's got to be
the whole story.
Yeah, it's got to be tied to it. So, I mean, from the big picture, I've tested my testosterone for a long time. I've been between 650 and 700 forever.
Yeah, total T doesn't mean anything.
No, but true. I
can tell you from experience.
Yeah, my free testosterone is always around the same too.
Okay, so you're looking at least beyond just.
I'm looking at total free estrogen. I look at all of them.
Panel.
I've stayed pretty consistent. Cortisol, all of my numbers have stayed pretty consistent of age, but I still have seen a noticeable.
It's not going to be the whole story.
It's not the whole story, but I think it's part of it. And some people might respond, more based on different changes. But yeah, there's something under there happening. I looked at your opinion on the recent papers that have kind of suggested that rather than a linear cause, there may be some inflection points. Do you think that's the case, or do you think that's too early to say?
I think it's too early to say with certainty. I think we're seeing different lines of evidence suggesting that for lack of a better way of saying it, the rate of aging may not be linear with age. Like there may be certain periods in life where it accelerates biological aging. The reason why I say it's too early and I even hesitate to use those words is I think we don't understand what biological aging actually is well enough to be able to say
Quantify
with
it.
confidence what that means. But certainly when you look across different species, like dogs and humans are really interesting, right? This idea of 1 dog year is 7 human year. 1 human year is 7 dog years, right? That on average across the lifespan for a dog of a certain size fits, but that proportion is much higher early in life, maybe 20-1 early in life, and then it tails off when you compare an aging dog versus an aging human. So that's not linear. There's no reason to think that the rate of aging is going to be linear in people. And there's at least a few lines of evidence now that, maybe in your 40s at some point, maybe in your 60s at some point, on average, not going to be the same for everyone, there are these periods of accelerated biological aging.
Do you think it's, I mean, I guess I almost look at it from I don't know if this is a good analogy or not, but like an injury standpoint, like you have the conditions for an injury kind of under the surface, and at some point the tissue crosses a threshold where it no longer can have the strength to do the action in order to CNS fires wrong, and then boom, you get the injury. Do you think it's maybe like things bubble up on it, like eventually you cross some threshold and that's a cascade?
I don't
Like
know.
what would explain that? It's an
Yeah.
odd thing.
I think, if we look at ovarian aging, that's kind of like the most extreme case of this, right? Where in evolution has selected in humans for women to undergo this pronounced ovarian aging process within a pretty constrained window of life, right? I mean, all women go through menopause and it's within about a 20-year period.
Sure.
So there are biological mechanisms that can be put in place to cause senescence. And so that might be what's happening, that there are, for reasons we don't understand, humans have evolved to go through these periods of accelerated aging. Now, at the molecular level, is it a damage? What you're talking about is sort of a damage accumulation idea. Damage accumulates to a certain point, then you hit a threshold and things sort of spiral out of control. That could be part of it, although that wouldn't explain why you have maybe these bursts and then it sort of settles out again.
Yeah.
I think we don't know. It's fascinating biology.
The question would be, assuming that does play out, do things like rapamycin or other similar things that we see, knock down mTOR and whatever else.
Yeah.
Do those things just push those accelerated points back, or do they fundamentally change?
I think they
those
fundamentally
points?
change, and the reason why I would at least segmentally, and what I mean by that is we know that you can give rapamycin, for example, now in mice, but I think we're getting data in people suggesting this is true as well. You can actually reverse functional declines in an aged animal. I'm not going to say you've reversed aging.
Sure.
You can improve functions and you can reverse some molecular features. So it's not as simple as just slowing.
It's something else
More
entirely.
complicated than that.
I wonder too, just from an exercise standpoint, and thinking about this, I mean, cardiovascular fitness blunts mTOR for a little while.
Yeah.
I wonder how much of, again, maybe high VO2, or maybe part of that mechanism is it's dialing down
It's all
mTOR
going to
just
be
a little
tied
bit,
together,
right?
right? And I agree. I think what we see when we start peeling the onion with all these things is these connections, right? And we've already touched on this, the connections between HRV and the vagus nerve and mitochondrial function, and DNA damage is going to be in there, and inflammation.
Yep.
So all these things are connected. We don't understand the network that underlies those connections at all, right?
Sure.
That's sort of the holy grail of aging research.
And I was wondering too, just kind of in the fitness world, in the everyday world, this is not a big problem. In the fitness world, there are people, myself included at one point, who are lifting weights 6 days a week, at high levels, high volumes. You're constantly cranking the growth pathways.
That's
like,
right.
Nonstop.
Yeah.
And I've looked at some recent paper, I'll send you if you haven't seen them. Like, they do look at all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease, and they're longitudinal, self-reported, which has its limitations. But you do see people on the very high end of the lifting spectrum, the numbers go the wrong direction.
Right.
Like, I do wonder if
overactivation
overactivation of that through just huge amounts of training
could be
negative.
Yeah, could be.
Blood
Could
pressure
also be
spikes, or who knows.
structural changes to the heart.
Yeah.
Could be a lack of recovery, right? I mean,
Yeah,
all these
exactly.
things
All of them.
hard to know.
I can just tell you anecdotally, being in that world, the high level strength athletes, the high level bodybuilders, they don't tend to live the longest.
No, but I think
lives. There's
oftentimes
multiple
that's
causes
also
for that.
influenced by chemical supplements.
Sure, yeah.
It's real complicated.
It is, yeah.
Going back to this accelerated aging periods, though, I wonder if is there any data on HRV changes at population level as a function of aging? Does it seem linear?
There are changes population level, and you do see Kind of depends on what market you're looking at and what population cohort you're looking at. But you do see periods where it does not look particularly linear, because so Morpheus uses a log natural transform to normalize the data, which makes it look a little bit more linear. But if you
Yeah.
look at the raw
Oh, that's
RMSST,
fascinating.
there are some periods
Yeah.
where it isn't
Well,
up there.
there's a research
There
project
could
to
be, yeah, that
line
makes you
that up
dial
with
in,
these
yeah.
other
That
markers,
would be
right?
super fascinating. But
Yeah.
I will say, good thing about HRV is you do see, again, depends what day, you can increase your HRV 20, 30%. Like, let's say you can probably have the HRV as somebody 20 years younger than you.
Right.
Now,
So
obviously you're not
now
reversing
that
anything,
you've geeked
but
out on the biology, the important message is it's never too late,
it's
or
never
close
too
to
late.
never too late
No,
to
absolutely.
have an
I
impact.
mean, we have people in using Morpheus in their 70s and 80s who have the HRV of a 50-year-old on
Yeah.
average. So you can
Yeah.
make a big difference, and that just reflects all the things you're doing. Build aerobic fitness and resilient, all that stuff can still be trained,
Right.
until
Right.
you're
I think
not
that's a
here.
really important message to continue to give people.
It is.
Okay, so let's look future a little bit. Where do you see? I mean, we kind of talked about where HRV measurements are today. I think you would argue Morpheus is the gold standard for at least what the average consumer could probably do. Where do you see the technology going in the future? Will we get to a point where we'll have wearables that are going to really do this real time, all the time,
I mean,
in an accurate way?
I think so. We'll get there, sure. And I think the other thing is, ultimately, it's decision making, and wearables can't make decisions for you, but they can at least push you in the right direction. I think
Right.
we need to have integration between wearable data, lab data,
Yeah.
market different. I mean, right now we don't really have that connection. Like, I have millions of data points of workouts and HRV and changes in lifestyle, from sleep, activity. I don't have that connection to biomarkers and blood samples.
Oh,
I don't have any of
okay.
that.
Well, we can help you there.
So, like, I think that, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, like, I think we could eventually,
Yeah.
like, how much does HRV change in relation to these different biomarkers that we can
Right.
test in the lab? I don't know. I don't have that data, but I think eventually we can build a much more comprehensive data model that can just give people much better information to make decisions from, or help make their decisions easier, because they're not having to look through a million different numbers to figure out what each one means, because people on average don't want to do that. And I don't think we understand how HRV changes in relation to these different hormonal markers, or these
Right.
different, like, we don't know.
Right.
We just know it changes, but maybe we figure out, hey, if we optimize these labs, it causes a slower decline in HRV, which maybe we find out means something. We just don't have that data. And I think that's going to be really valuable to get.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so we've got some audience questions. We asked people to send in questions for you, so we've got a few here. I guess we haven't actually talked about this yet. Does HRV increase or decrease at night? And I guess we could say while sleeping.
It
So you
varies.
sleep at
It
night.
varies with your sleeping cycles. So it's going to be higher or lower depending on what stage of sleep you're in.
And in general, is it higher or lower at night than during the day, or is it?
It's going to be, you really shouldn't be sympathetic at night.
Right.
So
Right.
it's going to be higher at night on average,
Okay.
but it goes through these cyclical patterns where
I
the deeper sleep you're in, you're more anabolic, you're more parasympathetic.
Right.
Your HRV is going to be higher.
Right. And when I read this, it occurred to me there are people who do night shifts, right? Is there any data on HRV and people who do shift work?
Yeah,
I don't-
it's honestly, it's very stressful. Most people.
yeah,
Like,
that's what I was gonna
having a
think
very
might be the
irregular
case, but-
having a very irregular sleep pattern is very hard on people. It tends to accelerate all kinds of stuff in health stand. Just from what I've seen, like, I've worked with
Yeah.
a lot of firefighters and shift workers.
Yeah.
My mom was a flight attendant. I go back to my mom's story, but she was a flight attendant, and she started traveling from Seattle to New York just to go to her job, and that really, in my mind, accelerated her decline when she had a stroke. Because it's just so hard in the body to have irregular sleep patterns, irregularity in general. I think the easiest way to say things is, the more unknown or the more irregular things are, the more stressful they are to the body. It's fairly simple, and that
Sure.
accumulates over time. So if you have
Sure.
a very irregular sleep pattern, it's very detrimental from my experience to people's health.
Yeah. And even in an acute sense, is there data on like international flights and things like that? Does that depress HRV?
In general, I can tell you anecdotally, sure.
Yeah.
I can't track down people who are doing it for the most part, but anecdotally, yeah. And I will say that's one of the bigger things I've noticed as I've aged is it's travel as a
Sensitivity to
sensitivity to
travel.
travel, because I've traveled a lot in 20s and 30s. Like,
Yeah.
you'd be jet lagged and you'd see it reflected in the data, but now it takes me much longer to kind of get back to a baseline state after I've traveled internationally.
Right.
It might be taking me a day or two. This time it could take me a week
Wow.
for the same trip.
Yeah.
Back and forth. So it definitely, you can
I've got
see
a lot
that.
of international travel coming up, so
Yeah, you can
nothing
see it.
in this
You can
direction
see
in
it.
this
You can see it.
conversation.
Unfortunately, you can
So
see it.
far, I feel pretty good. I feel like my jet lag has not gotten worse as I've gotten
Yeah,
older.
mine unfortunately has. So
We'll see. I'm sure I'll get there. Okay. One person's wondering about, can you give any specifics on breathwork protocols to improve HRV? And does it matter when you do the breathwork? Time of day, duration, nasal or mouth breathing, sitting or laying down? We're
Yeah.
best principles.
Yeah. So in general, when we say we're raising our HRV with breath work or these things, we are turning on that parasympathetic system. We're not necessarily raising your baseline tone per se, like we're not increasing your average over time, but we are getting that system to fire, which
It's
has
an acute
it's
effect.
the acute effect,
Yeah.
but it does have the benefit of if you're in this kind of chronically sympathetic state, you're stressed out, even just breaking that cycle for a 5 or 10-minute period
Right.
can be beneficial. So
Right.
the simplest thing is the prolonged exhale is where we are turning that sympathetic system, our parasympathetic system higher, right? We're turning dial up as we exhale. So any breathing pattern where you are exhaling for a long, slow, extended, deliberate period of time is going to have that acute effect. There are some apps out there that focus on coherence, which is like the specific respiratory cycle. We see the higher HRV.
Okay.
Some of those can be good. I think more than anything, that just doing something consistently, breaking that cycle is beneficial for people, particularly like the type A personalities who are just, they live in that stress all day.
Right.
A 5 or 10-minute break can change that. So I would say whatever people find relaxing and they can do consistently and they enjoy, like a dark room, a quiet room, and some breath work for 10 minutes can have a pretty profound impact on a lot of people. So try to combine that light, noise, and breath work together, and you get a cumulative effect in my
Yeah.
experience.
And I would imagine also, outside of having that sort of, if you find that doing it at a certain time of day every day is good for you, if you feel yourself in a
Yeah,
situation where you know you're stressed,
then you can.
that's a good time to do it.
Yeah,
It may not matter whether you're sitting down.
I don't think it matters tremendously from a time of day. It just matters when you're stressed. Turn that off is a
Yeah.
good thing.
Yeah, makes sense. Any relationship between nighttime food intake and HRV? Do you know
Yeah.
anything about that?
I mean, if you are increasing digestion right before you go to bed, that can play a role, particularly, or obviously alcohol, like we talked about.
Sure.
So,
Right.
yeah, you tend to see, again, that's why I think when you're measuring overnight, you're just kind of measuring the effects of what you did in the bleeding hours
I
up to
see.
it. So, and again, going back to food's a big one, obviously. People have food sensitivities that they aren't aware of.
Right.
And so a lot of times you'll have somebody who's chronically low HRV, or it's just all over the place despite them feeling like they're doing the right things, and you start doing some sort of elimination diet, and sometimes you find something that just kind of instantly clicks and you see a baseline raise of, a reasonable amount that would
Wow.
suggest that whatever they were eating they were more sensitive to than they thought. So
Yeah.
if people have that, dairy allergies or gluten or a million things, if people are sensitive to those things, if you eliminate them, oftentimes you can see a measurable improvement.
Do we know about any supplements, or we talked about peptides, medications that are worth noting that have been found to increase HRV?
I mean, supplements, I hesitate to say there's anything super powerful. I
Yeah.
mean, if you are chronically inflamed and you throw in some, even just NSAIDs actually will
okay.
increase your
Yeah,
HRV.
sure.
That's actually a good test that you can do every once in a while. Is you take a couple of NSAIDs, and if your HRV bounces up 5, it depends on the system, but if it bounces up noticeably, it could
Yeah.
be that you've
Yeah.
got some low-grade
Would
inflammation
you expect
there.
to see that if, let's say you've got the Morpheus, you got the best way to measure it? Would you expect to see that in the next day then?
Yeah, next day, if you do NSAIDs, yeah, you see
Yeah.
it overnight. Like if
Interesting.
you were to do like an overnight NSAID, or
Okay.
yeah, you
That'll
absolutely
tell you if you're chronically inflamed.
it'll
At
give you
least the
the
type of inflammation that the NSAIDs are
can
affecting.
treat. Yeah, I mean, there's some research, fish oil here and there, and the
Yeah.
data has shown some
Yeah, yeah.
increases, small things like that. But the effects are somewhat small in my
Yeah.
experience. I can tell you what's interesting to me is statins. That's a long topic we can talk when I come back, but statins have raised my HRV a bit. But at the same time, they, particularly rosuvastatin, made it more reactive, which I don't think was awesome. And I think part of that is because it impacts mitochondrial function.
Uh-huh.
It inhibits complex 1. So I switched
Yeah.
to pitavastatin.
Yeah.
That seems to have been mellowed out
That's
significantly.
interesting.
Super
Yeah.
interesting.
Would be interesting if metformin does the same thing, because that also can inhibit
Yeah.
complex 1, right?
Yeah, it could
So,
be. Yeah, I
huh.
don't know. I've been playing around with
Fascinating.
metformin for a long time.
So nothing that's come across your radar.
Nothing that would be like, oh, this is a dramatic improvement.
Yeah. And what about the other direction in terms of reducing HRV? Anything?
Yeah, anything that's very sympathetic, like any of the stimulants. We don't hear about the thermogenics as much. The thermogenics used to be a really big body weight
Yeah,
thing.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
GLP-1s will lower it for sure.
Because of it, is that in food or inflammatory? I mean, they're connected, right?
Yeah,
So, yeah.
exactly. But yeah,
Yeah.
most people see a drop in their HRV from this. Is probably an indication of, we know the GLP-1s have health benefits. I also tell you they lower your HRV, but there seems to be just
Oh, they lower HRV. Oh, interesting.
they seem to. Yeah,
Is that acute or
I think
chronic? I mean, if you're on a GLP,
from what I've
once a year.
seen, it's pretty chronic. It doesn't seem to go away,
Interesting.
but how much it does depends on dose and the individual.
Yeah.
And some of it's just it's turning down, it's slowing down gastric empty and all that sort of stuff. I don't know what the exact mechanisms are,
We might, yeah.
but it
When you come
does.
back, we might have to do a little deeper dive on that. See
Yeah.
what we can find out. That's interesting.
And it,
Surprises me.
and again, it's different. And well, retatrutide, the newest one,
Mm-hmm.
increases your resting heart rate significantly,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
3 to 5 beats or more, and that's inherently going to do it too.
Does weight loss through caloric restriction have an effect on HRV?
Usually increases it.
Okay, so this is interesting because the GLPs are going to have that effect, but they're going the opposite direction.
There's something there.
Okay.
What exactly? I don't know.
Okay, that's interesting and potentially a cautionary.
Yeah, but we know there
are other benefits.
Yeah, so I don't know.
And then in terms of it, if you could give an absolute number, is there an HRV level where people should really be concerned? Like, okay, this is a problem, we need to fix it.
Sure. I mean, again, the problem with this is it comes down to I guess we didn't dive into this, but there are multiple ways to quantify HRV.
Yeah.
Right? So I'll give you the short stories are kind of two broad ways to do it. One is just what's called time domain series, where you take the numbers and you run some math on it and get your number. The other is called spectral analysis, where they actually break it down to frequencies and they do more or less the same thing. But you're going to get very different numbers based on which one you're looking at. The good thing is now the majority of apps, and I would say, so let's say Oura, Garmin, Whoop, not Apple, but those three, which are big ones, use RMSSD.
And what does Apple do? It's different.
They use one's called SDNN, which is, I don't know why they use that, because that was developed in more medical setting or more common medical settings, where they'd like leave it on you for a day and just kind of look at your average across the day, because it was more of just like, is this person going to die immediately? What did any reactivity, right?
Important, but
yeah, it's not really used in the same context. So I don't know why Apple used SDNN. It's a good question. Right. But anyway, RMSSD, they can look up a lot of research on that one because a lot of them are on there. The problem is it's not normalized. It's very right skewed. And what I mean by that is people are mostly going to fall between like 40 and 60, let's say, on average in RMSSD. But then like an elite athlete could be like 150. So you've got this big bulk, but then you've got this really long tail aside. So that's skewed data. So with Morpheus, we normalized it, doing a log natural transform, right? So Morpheus data, you're typically between like 50 and 100. Like a super elite athlete would be 100, like a very low number. Morpheus would be like 50 or below. On these other systems, they're just giving you the raw RMSS data, or RMSSD, I should say, like a 20, a 30, like 20s really low, 30s pretty low. Mostly that's going to correlate also with resting heart rates that are in the 70s or 80s really high. You're typically going to see that relationship. So again, I would say if you're on the lower end, like I am, it's something to be aware of. Like, it doesn't mean you're going to die or that you have, cardiovascular disease, but it could mean that you should be more aware of these things, and you should probably be more proactive in screening, particularly if you have the family history that I have, or that if you have that as well. That's another red flag. So I would say a lower HRV is definitely not a guarantee, but it's probably an indication. Like, look into things a little more thoroughly than you would if you had a much higher HRV, or at least be aware if you have lower HRV and bad family history for these things.
And is there a number that you look at and you're like, ooh?
Yeah. So in Morpheus, I would say like a 40
would
be pretty bad. In RMSSD, like I said, a Garmin, like a 20s would be really low.
And is there anything people should do if they get that result? Should you go immediately go see your doctor?
No, I mean, so we've had plenty of people have arrhythmias that we've sent in, and they found some stuff there. So sometimes it could be caused by an arrhythmia. Sometimes it could be caused by medication that they're really reacting to. But if there's nothing that you're acutely aware of, and all your health metrics look normal, and don't have anything that's acutely causing it, then I would be
don't freak out.
Don't freak out, but I would probably look into number one, like also it's like, is your aerobic fitness terrible? Well, start,
then you know how to
you know where to improve it, right? It's if you're really aerobically fit and your number tanks into the bottom 10th percentile of your age group, something's probably
you need to figure out.
What's changed. And like I said, a lot of times it is an arrhythmia will cause inaccurate numbers. Or people will have some heart medication, beta blockers, all this stuff will impact it pretty significantly.
What is the impact of beta blockers?
It'll lower it. Yeah.
Okay, So there are medications that definitely are known to have this.
Absolutely.
This effect.
Yeah.
And mostly those are, I'm guessing, going to be medications that affect heart function, heart rate.
Anything affecting your heart rate or heart rhythm, and it's going to have some impact. It's different for everyone, but it's definitely an impact. There's no question. ADHD meds will lower it fairly significantly, actually.
Okay.
Like any sort of stimulant type thing will lower your HRV.
Right.
Noticeably.
You mentioned stimulants. What about caffeine?
It's pretty minimal.
Okay.
I mean, if you're pounding 5 coffees, it'll probably lower it. If you're having a coffee a day, and also depends on if you're a fast or slow metabolizer. I think that tends to impact things as well. It's not the same.
Yeah.
I will say again, going back to aging, I'm much more sensitive to caffeine than I used to be.
Really?
Personally, yeah. I don't know why. I'm
Okay.
sure it's part of the process, but
Yeah.
I never drink a huge amount of caffeine, but I notice it more now, and I see it more now than when I used to be younger. And
Aging. We got to do something.
yeah,
Yeah.
one of these days. I mean, I'll ask you, what do you think? Where do you think the interplay is going to come between these compounds that seem to impact the process of aging versus this other idea of like just resetting everything? Like at some point,
Yeah.
do you think it's gonna be both? Do you think one's gonna win out? Like,
Well, I mean, I think it also depends on time frame, right? So I think short time frame, I mean, lifestyle is the biggest thing we can do right now. The reason why lifestyle factors work is because they affect the biology of aging. And then I think we have some other tools like rapamycin and other interventions that work in laboratory animals that might have a positive impact in people on top of that. I think this idea of like reversing aging, the only thing right now that looks like it might have a shot at doing that to any significant effect is epigenetic reprogramming. Even there, I'm not convinced it's really reversing aging. It is reversing some aspects of aging, which almost all these interventions do. So I'm not really confident that truly reversing aging, like everything that goes wrong with aging, is on the horizon in any short term. I do wonder whether it will be easier to do replacement versus reversing aging. And there are lots of strategies that are being taken to replace body parts. That's more of an engineering problem, although it's clearly biology. I think that I see a path there for everything except the brain at this point. So the answer is I don't know.
yeah.
But I don't feel like we're really
We're
close.
really
Like,
not as close
the
to this.
Ray
this
Kurzweil,
yeah,
longevity escape velocity
not
is 2
not.
years away. I don't see any reason. I hope it's true.
Yeah,
I just don't see any
it
reason.
seems like
to
the
believe
artificial
it's-
general intelligence. You got one people say, "Oh, we're next to general intelligence in the next few years." Other people saying like, "Oh, we're pretty
Yeah,
far."
and I mean, and then of course the people are AI is going to solve aging for us, and I'm like, no, garbage in, garbage out, guys. We need to understand aging better. So
Sure.
I hope I'm wrong, but I do think there are significant things that can be done to improve health span quite substantially and probably increase lifespan more modestly.
Yeah, that makes sense. I
Um,
mean, one thing I've always kind of wondered, but get your thoughts, like when you're looking at animal studies, to me, it seems like one of the biggest limitations, if what we're talking about in terms of resilience is a defining characteristic of
Yeah.
aging, and that has to be exposed to stress to test that or improve that in some
Yeah.
sense. If the animals are just sitting in the cages, they're not really exposed to the same level of stress humans are. Do you think that's one of the problems why we don't see everything we test in animals work fundamentally great, and then they go
Yeah,
humans and they fail? Or do you think
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure that's part of it.
Yeah.
But I also think, I mean, even animals in cages, right, in a very well controlled environment, they get the same age-related functional declines, molecular declines, and diseases that we do. So the aging process is still happening,
Sure.
and to some extent the same way from a biological.
Do we have good research that, because I was looking at, do we have good research that doing exercise in animals is slowing those things down? Like, does that model work in animals too?
It does. I think the challenge there is that it's hard to do good quality exercise studies in rodents and measure lifespan. So I think it's pretty clear exercise in rodents can improve a variety of what we call health span metrics. So functional declines that
Sure.
go along with aging. It's less clear that exercise increases lifespan in rodents. There are even people though who will argue it's not clear in people that exercise increases lifespan, and it gets really complicated. I believe it does,
Yeah.
but it gets really complicated. So
Even, I mean, we know it reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease limits your lifespan. So
sure.
there's your
I think the
number.
question is it, what is the magnitude of effect, and is
Sure.
it detectable from this gets into statistics and
Yeah.
all that stuff, right? So, but again, I do feel like aging in laboratory animals is a better model than trying to give a young mouse cancer, give a young mouse heart disease, right? It's more closely recapitulating human aging, and this idea that that mice are a terrible model for human biology, I think largely comes from the way the animals have been used, and that we've tried to study diseases of aging in young mice, and that doesn't work. I think studying diseases of aging in old mice is going to work better. I don't know how well.
Make more sense, obviously.
So anyways, there's it's still unknown, and I do think the environment is huge, right? That is something we can't really model in animal
Depressed
models.
mice versus the mouse in social communities.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
actually, what if you put a mouse in complete isolation? What happens?
No, there's
pretty
pretty good
significant.
data actually that the mice in the laboratory are in a environmentally isolated state. And if you give them environmental enrichment, you can actually have positive effects on their aging process, right?
Interesting.
So yeah, so there's all sorts of stuff we do that we don't even understand the impact. It's just the way we do it in the laboratory because it's easy and controlled and all that.
Yeah.
Okay, but back to you. I'm supposed to be interviewing you,
Yeah.
not the other way around. So let's just wrap it up. I kind of want you to give a kind of bigger picture answer. If you think back, in the last 20 years, you've worked with world-class athletes, very, very high performers. If you had to think about like what's one of the biggest myths that people have around performance that you've seen?
I mean, I think the single most pervasive myth that I've seen across my career, which I think is starting to train, is that it's just intensity. Like I think there's been this mindset, at least in the fitness space for a long time, high intensity really started dominating the research field in like the early 2000s, and it kind of just grew. And there's a lot of benefits behind intensity. You need some high intensity, but I think kind of people just made this assumption that effort equals outcome, and like more effort and
More is
intensity,
better.
more is
Yeah.
better, right? And I think that myth of both just intensity and just more is better in general
Yeah.
has really been pervasive across fitness, and it translates in the general public, which I think is a negative because a lot of times people are like, oh, I can't do enough, and then they get discouraged,
Right.
or they go so hard that they
Right.
burn themselves out. And
Right.
so I think what I've seen over the years is most average people who work 40-hour week or 50-hour week, they have families, they have just life stress, right? Those people, if they go in the gym 3 to 4 days a week and they try to slam themselves with high intensity, it's a recipe for failure. It
Right.
just is. It's not.
Or only do it on the weekends.
Yeah.
The weekend warrior.
Yeah, exactly. It's not
mindset.
sustainable. It's
Yeah.
not going to lead to a long-term improvement. So
Right.
I think just that idea of more is better or no pain, no gain, those ideas are just not conducive to long-term sustainable improvements for the average person. And they're even at the high level. So when we were training fighters at a high level every week, we didn't spar, which is the highest intensity, more than twice a week. And we'd see other gyms doing it 3, 4, 5 days a week. Their athletes would be successful, but they'd burn out. They'd get injured. They'd have short careers. All the fighters came through AMC twice a week, Tuesdays and Saturdays were sparring. That was just where the high intensity days were. And the rest of the days were lower intensity and more managed. And so I think if people can just realize that you're not going to win by playing the short game over the long term. The short game is high intensity. The long game is consistency. So that'd be the single biggest thing I would say.
And I think that applies to longevity.
Yeah,
right? I mean,
exactly. Yeah, it's finding what you can sustainably do over the course of your life from a diet standpoint, from a sleep strategy standpoint, a training standpoint. Being consistent over decades is how you're going to win those games. Not I'm going to win this next 8 weeks and lose 5 pounds or whatever. But the problem is we're very short-term oriented human beings, right? We have to be, right?
Right. Well,
we had to be evolutionarily, maybe not,
right.
not now, but we're very hardwired, I think, to have this short-term survival mindset or short-term mindset.
Which, to bring it full circle, is why biomarkers like HRV, like the blood work that we use all the time, like body composition, are so important.
Yep.
Right? Because they can help you monitor over time
Exactly
the trajectory that you're on and make sure that things are going in the right direction.
Yeah, and finally, I would just add to this, really, really important is realistic expectations.
Yeah, right.
Because this is what kills most people is they see a magazine, they look at social media, they see something, and like they have this really unrealistic expectation of what's going to happen.
Right.
And when they don't achieve it, they become less motivated to continue. Like, if you lost a pound, but you expected to lose 5, you're frustrated. If you expected to lose a pound, you meet your goal, you keep going.
Yeah.
And I think social media and everything else has distorted what's possible with human body in specific time frames. Like unless you're on lots of drugs with good genetics, which most people aren't.
Which may not be great for your long-term.
Yeah, exactly, right? Most people's idea of what's possible is very skewed from what's really possible in terms of body composition, strength gains, VO2 max. It doesn't happen overnight, and you just have to be able to shift this idea of short-term, 8 weeks, 6 to a long-term thing. Or if you're going to have short-term things, make sure that they are realistic of what can be achieved.
Right, and consistent with the long-term goal. Right.
Consistent with a long-term goal, and have a long-term goal. What are you trying to get to?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to wrap this up. So thank you so much for coming by today. This has been a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to the next time we can get together.
Yeah, it was great to talk to you, and look forward to coming back.
Awesome.